Welcome to the latest episode of The Independent. I'm Pete Sampson. Bit of a solo show today as we get ready for Notre Dame's first-round playoff game against Indiana. We've got Zach Osterman on the show from the Indianapolis Star. He's been the beat writer of the Hoosiers for more than 10 years, so plenty of backstory and perspective on what kind of season India is having, how out of nowhere this has been, what problems they might cause for Notre Dame, and where the Irish can get them, and also some insight into Curt Cignetti, who's a bit of a big personality, kind of a character in college football this season, which on this show we love characters. So Zach had plenty to say about all that. I think you'll learn a lot about Indiana, maybe have a different perspective on what the Hoosiers are, maybe what they aren't, based on their schedule. Spent a bunch of time talking about the Ohio State and Michigan game, sort of the 6 quarters of the season where Indiana sort of struggled. As for the game itself, if you read my mailbag on Friday on The Athletic, and it's hard to believe we're basically a week away from kickoff, some insight on ticketing. I think I've got more questions about that than anything else in terms of the opening round game, what the stadium is going to look like, how much red is going to be in there. Notre Dame never let these tickets get to market, and those went to donors. It went to season ticket holders. But there was no chance for an Indiana fan to just sort of buy them at face value. The secondary market, however, you've been checking that out. As of Friday morning, when I looked on SeatGeek, there were 4 times as many ticket sort of postings, which could be 1 ticket, could be 10 tickets. 4 times as many for the Penn State SMU game, and 4 times as many for the Ohio State Tennessee game than there were for Notre Dame Indiana. So what does that tell you? Well, one, it doesn't cost a lot to see Notre Dame Indiana. And as I've said on this podcast before, I've written it a bunch on The Athletic. Notre Dame football doesn't do firsts a whole lot because pretty much everything's been done around here. This is a first, and my sense is that the Notre Dame fan base will show out for this game in a way that we didn't see for Nebraska in 2000 or Georgia in 2017 or even Cincinnati in 2021. And look, there's a lot Notre Dame, the institution, can do to make it harder for opposing fans to buy tickets. And I think they've done that. The success that they had against Ohio State had a lot to do with the business operations of the athletic department and making those tickets hard to get. Patrick Nolan, who I interviewed, Ulander Wells, who I interviewed for a story on that last year, had a lot to say about, like, look, there's a lot we can do, but in the end, the biggest thing that we need is for Notre Dame fans not to sell their tickets. I think that's what you're seeing this time around too, is Notre Dame fans being more likely to show up for this. And I referenced sort of the Nebraska, Georgia, Cincinnati, and I think it's worth keeping in mind, like, what are the differences between those situations and what Notre Dame has going on now? I think the Notre Dame fan base is much more behind this team than those 3. 2000, Notre Dame's coming off a losing season under Bob Davie. The fans had sort of turned on that. 2017, coming off a losing season. I think the fans were beginning to tire a little bit of Brian Kelly. It was early in that year, which turned out to be a good season. And then 2021, I think, was kind of a tough watch if you were a Notre Dame fan, opening at Florida State in bizarre overtime fashion, needing some bizarre circumstances to get past Toledo. The Wisconsin game was fun, but weird. And then Cincinnati shows up. Their fan base, I wouldn't say took over Notre Dame Stadium, but they were loud. And I don't think the Notre Dame fan base was all that behind that squad that year. This team, they're sitting here at 11-1. Marcus Freeman is closing in on a contract extension. That's, I think, pretty far down the road at this point. There's a lot of enthusiasm for this team, and I think you'll see that show on Friday night against Indiana. You know, will it be 10% red, 5%, 15%, 20%? I'm not really sure. I would sort of think it would be a better turnout of Notre Dame fans than it was for Ohio State last year, and I thought that was pretty solid. So it'll be interesting to see how this all looks on December 20th. It's kind of hard to believe that it's as close as it is, but let's get to the interview with Zach Osterman from the Indianapolis Star. Plenty of insight on the Hoosiers, what makes them go, where they might be susceptible on Friday night, and obviously some talk about Coach Google, Curt Cignetti. Pleased to be welcomed on The Independent, the beat writer for the Indianapolis Star, Zach Osterman of IU football. And Zach, you've been around IU a long time, both as a professional journalist and as a student. And I'm not sure I'm curious if you felt like you would ever see a season like the one that you're covering right now.
No, I don't think I did. And I think in different ways, I do think there were stages in the offseason of wondering how good Indiana might be. There was definitely like a groundswell among fans of belief in Curt Cignetti that I'd never really seen before for any coaching hire, football, hoops, whatever. And then obviously did some interesting stuff in the portal, and then you looked at the schedule, and I picked him to win 8 games, but I have a friend who, in a group thread, I don't even remember this, but I sent something in February that said, like, I see a path for Indiana being 9-0 going into the Michigan game, and he saved it, and he brought it back out later and said, basically, I thought we'd all have a good laugh about this when we got to Michigan and they were 5-4 or whatever. But I mean, to this extent, like to this extreme, in terms of probably not just the fact that they've won 11 games, but the way they've won them. There were all these teams like BYU and Pitt that were kind of on a similar, like, larger arc, but they were kind of winning games late and making some mistakes. And, Indiana, with the exception of Michigan and Ohio State, just bulldozed kind of everything that came across its path. And every time you wondered if this team might show some weakness, at least, not against NFL level competition, on the other side of the ball, it just kind of turned it up a notch again. And so, no, it's been, I mean, I've seen some decent seasons. I think it's kind of lost in the ether a little bit that, like, from 1994 to 2014, Indiana went to one bowl game and I think had maybe 3 more 5-win seasons. And in the 10 years since then, across 3 different coaching tenures, they've been to 4 bowl games and a playoff appearance with 2 more 5-win seasons. So I've seen, an improved product, if you want to say that, if you want to kind of characterize it that way around Indiana football. But nothing like this, and nothing that anyone, I think, would have expected, or even in, like, the most optimistic fans' wildest dreams.
How obviously Curt Cignetti is the biggest reason for it, but I'm interested how much his sort of like tactical acumen balances out with the sheer force of personality there. And I think that a lot of Notre Dame fans have they know him as Google me coach, Purdue sucks coach, and we should have been hosting a home playoff game coach. And that's kind of I'm assuming that's like kind of reducing him to a character. But at the same time, I wonder if, like, that personality is part of the reason why Indiana is not just 11-1, but like they've steamrolled people to get to that point.
No, I think that's fair. I think a lot of the belief in Cignetti, before the season started, was just around the fact that he'd never been quite at this level, but everywhere he'd been, he'd won, and to a great extent, everywhere he'd been, obviously at lower levels, he'd outperformed expectations. But the only, quote unquote, easy job he'd ever had was those first couple years at James Madison when they were still down in the FCS, and JMU is, sort of historically had a lot of success in the FCS. But, Elon is a really tough job as somebody whose parents went to Georgia Southern and grew up watching a lot of Southern Conference football. That's not an easy job. Obviously there was sort of the challenge of bringing James Madison up to the FBS level and into the Sun Belt, and he just kind of navigated that without any real trouble. And I think it probably helped him that he was able to bring the assistants that he did and the players that he did, that just kind of settled, so much of however you want to quantify or sort of label that vague idea of culture. I think that helped really quickly. And I think that's, a lot of people have said, like, will he be able to do it when he doesn't have his JMU guys, that he was just able to call on 13 transfers, boom, boom, right away. I think, I generally sort of respond to that by pointing out that he's the one that recruited and developed a lot of those players. So it's his process that they're a product of. But I do think they were important to this season. Everything just kind of embedding very quickly into a program that obviously turned around, pretty substantially from a roster standpoint anyway. More than half the countable spots on the roster were new players by the time the season started. And you kind of got, you got that confidence, that infectiousness. I mean, like one of the quotes of the season for me was actually when Indiana went to Northwestern, and when they won at Northwestern, that got them to 6-0. And obviously for Indiana fans, it was just sort of like, hey, wow, we're bowl eligible, basically as quickly as we could possibly be. And Mikel Kamara, who came over with Cignetti from James Madison, said after the game, he said, like, this is nice, but like, this is not the end. This is not the goal. And that was the first day I ever heard anyone around the program use the term national championship. And I don't think anybody takes that lightly, and I'm sure there's some understanding that it's very difficult to do that. But I think everyone embraces kind of the idea that if you listen to what the man is selling and what he's saying, it works, because everywhere he's been, it has worked. And obviously this is probably going to be seen by a lot of people as the most extreme example of that, because it's the Big Ten. It's at a place that historically has just struggled so much for, competitiveness and relevance in football. But, it's I've said even since the offseason, he does have a little bit of Nick Saban in him. And I'm not saying he's going to be successful as Saban, but you see the influence that Saban would have had on him from his time with him at Alabama. And you see some similarities in their kind of their personalities. Obviously Cignetti's probably a little bit more, I don't know, bold, brash maybe. But the way they are able to just keep propelling their teams forward, keep things organized, details oriented, fresh and sharp. I think he's just got a group that, it helped, I think, to bring such a substantial chunk of James Madison with him. And I think that just sort of laid the foundation for everything else around it to buy in pretty quickly. And, and from there, all it kind of took was a couple kind of clever signings in the portal, and Indiana was off.
What do you make of the Ohio State performance as sort of emblematic of the ceiling of the team, or perhaps maybe it was a one-off, like you're not going to fumble a punt at your goal line every week or give up a return to Caleb Downs every week. So like what's the takeaway from Ohio State that you think applies to Friday night on December 20th? And what do you think you just sort of throw out as like, that was a one-off, I didn't see that 11 other weeks of the year?
Yeah, and actually I would include the second half of the Michigan game. Like it's kind of this like 6-quarter stretch, like, because the Michigan game, they were doing fine up to halftime, and then Michigan kind of flipped a couple things on them. Obviously, Michigan's not a great team this year, but they got a really good defensive line and a really good just kind of like front six defensively, and Indiana just kind of suddenly started to really struggle to block that. And then that did kind of carry into the Ohio State game. And so you feel like it's kind of like a 6-quarter stretch that felt very different to everything else Indiana had done this season.
So they had 42 other quarters that were great.
Right, yeah. But listen, the flip side to that is, especially when you're going to get into the playoff, whether it's Notre Dame, whether it's, I think in the last bracket before Selection Sunday, they were supposed to play Georgia. Like, when you get into the playoff, that's where you're going to see that level of talent, right? So it's a fair question to ask. And, there's some schematic things or some procedural things, like Cignetti talked about, basically the noise at Ohio Stadium. They had to go to a silent count. Then Ohio State figured out what their signals were for their silent count. And that's going to be obviously something you can't just adjust in 5 minutes on the sideline. And so they couldn't really do anything with it. I don't think it's completely unfair to look at Indiana and sort of say, particularly at the line of scrimmage and probably particularly on offense, when you start playing more high-level competition, it's going to get a little harder for you. But the flip side to that is, and this is where I think kind of the mystery is ahead of next Friday, is, as you point out there, like the two most important touchdowns of the game came on special teams miscues Indiana's not really made at any other point this season. Like, Indiana's special teams actually had been really, really solid, kind of unspectacular. They didn't need a lot because, I mean, I'm not trying to be flippant, but they didn't kick a lot of field goals and they didn't punt the ball a lot. But like it wasn't like special teams had been kind of a persistent problem, and it just like finally came back to bite them on a big stage. They just had basically the two worst moments of the season on special teams wound up being the two plays that arguably turned the most important game of the regular season. Because it's 7-7 when James Evans drops that punt. It's 14-7 when and Cignetti has said basically that there was a mix-up in the punt went one way, the coverage was supposed to go the other way, and that's what kind of created the opportunity for Downs to get the punt return. So it's even that game where, listen, I'm not going to sit here and argue that Indiana was closer than the experts think to winning it. They lost by 23 points. Like let's call it what it is. They struggled that day, but even that game kind of turns on two very uncharacteristic mistakes. And, if you want to go back, to the beginning of the season, like you could see Indiana learning procedurally from, they beat Florida International 31-7 in the first week of the season. And it's funny because now you look back at that and you think that's probably one of their worst performances.
Yeah.
But they learned from it. And they learned from Maryland and they learned from Northwestern. And by the time they're playing Michigan State, they're just sort of plowing through a Big Ten opponent on the road. And so I guess the question is a little bit like, will they learn from it again? And there will be an extent to which, you can't learn your way past talent. And so Notre Dame is going to be a problem at a level that, Indiana's only seen probably a couple other times this season. And that's why I do think the Michigan and Ohio State games, it's fair to ask those questions. But then I think it's equally fair to say, given the time to really digest that with this coaching staff and what this group has been able to accomplish so far this season, will we see a different Indiana in a similar position on Saturday or Friday night at Notre Dame Stadium? I'm not sure, but I'm fascinated by it because I'm fascinated by basically, excuse me, everything related to this Indiana season. Because at this point, I really have no idea where it's going to end.
As any longtime listener of The Independent could tell you, we're big youth sports fans at this podcast. I've watched a lot of it. I've coached a lot of it. And that's why we're excited to partner with a new brand called Future Fans that helps kids ages 4 to 8 better understand football so that they can become better fans. Instead of having to explain something like downs or offsides, think about activity books or games that kids can play to learn and love the sport that you love. Future Fans offers a football introduction packet for $49.99, and listeners of The Independent can use promo code Irish for 15% off that order. Makes for a great Christmas gift. So help grow your kids into better football fans and have them follow along with the fun that you will be following in the college football playoff. That's futurefans.com, promo code Irish for 15% off your first order. Kurtis Rourke, number 1 in the country, pass efficiency, that jumps off the page, really under an extreme amount of duress at Ohio State, like you said. But when you look at that box score, they gave up, 350 yards to Ohio State? Defensively, they've been pretty rock solid all year. And aside from the magic touch of Pat Kuntz down there, what's been the key to Indiana being that good on defense as consistently as they've been all year? Because to me, I look at I don't think Indiana's going to score a whole lot on Notre Dame. I don't know how much Notre Dame is going to score on Indiana either. And so, if Indiana's defense is balls out on December 20th, what will have worked, and why has that defense been as good as it's been all year?
Yeah, I mean, that's the group that I think was probably surprising. You looked at the, if you asked me, and like I said, I think I picked them to win 8 games in the preseason, and I did that largely in my belief in the offense. It's Cignetti's offense. Obviously he brought more coaches on that side of the ball than he did on defense, but it's his scheme. He's the one that kind of dreamed that up, and everything that kind of spokes out of that starts with him. He'll freely admit he leaves a lot more of the defense than the offense to the defensive staff. And he's got Brian Haynes, who's his defensive coordinator at James Madison, was actually a GA at Indiana years ago. And I mean, Haynes is a Broyles Award finalist, and I really wouldn't be shocked if he wins it. And I know that's, you and I are both Liverpool fans. Broyles Award winner, you'll never sing that. But it's been remarkable what Indiana has done on defense. Even that Ohio State game, they had Ohio State under 300 yards before they attempted the onside kick. Ohio State recovered it, on the next play, Travion Henderson tore off a 40-yard run because Indiana was selling out to try and get some, tackle for loss, try and flip the chains, one last sort of desperate hope at trying to turn that game around. So even Ohio State, on the road in Columbus, they were in a great spot, broadly speaking, defensively. The big thing structurally is that they have been able to control the line of scrimmage, stop the run, and pressure the quarterback with 4. And at Indiana, I've seen some decent Indiana defenses in the past. Tom Allen obviously had some, or even some Indiana defenses that maybe gave up a lot of yards and in some cases a lot of points, but they were able to be really opportunistic. They pressured the quarterback really well. They had, ball hawking corners and things like that. This group, it's not the biggest defensive line in the world. And I think sometimes that's why it gets underestimated. But this group has controlled the line of scrimmage pretty well against almost everyone it's faced. They lead the country in rushing yards allowed per game. And it's not because they've faced a bunch of teams that didn't want to run the ball. They're one of the best teams in the country at pressuring the quarterback. I think Mikel Kamara still leads the country in QB pressures. I don't know if those numbers changed from conference championship week, but they don't rotate a ton. They're very experienced. And like I said, they are able to control the line of scrimmage at a level that I've never seen from an Indiana defense without needing to do anything gimmicky, without needing to do, anything kind of risky in terms of really, really sort of clever blitz packages. And not that they don't blitz, but they're not bringing safeties up the middle. They're not, a lot of their twist and stunt stuff is just kind of two-man game, particularly between Kamara and CJ West, their nose tackle. Their linebackers are really solid. Aiden Fisher was one of the leading tacklers in the Big Ten this season, and I actually think Jalen Walker's better. But they also don't ask those guys to kind of have to do anything to sell out. They just let them play linebacker and kind of fly around because they're not saying you got to go, like Tom Allen, I guess as an example, and I'm rambling here a bit, forgive me. But Tom Allen's defense is often his leaders in pressures and sacks would be his linebackers because he needed to be, kind of creative about how he brought pressure, and he needed to take the risk of sending blitzes and those blitzes getting home and that being kind of what slowed teams down. Mm-hmm. This team just controls the line of scrimmage, and they stop the run. They don't get run on much, and that allows them to crank up the pressure on opposing quarterbacks and really make things difficult for them. Now, this to me, and I will confess that, in terms of scheme, I couldn't tell you. I haven't watched enough Notre Dame to know what they're all about this season. But what I would say is a quarterback that is a big part of the run game is not something they've seen a lot of this year.
Okay. Will
Howard hurt him with it a little bit, but Howard's not like Riley Leonard. He's much more of kind of if he rolls out and there's green grass, he'll tuck it, And the other thing too with Riley Leonard is it's not just the old sort of quote unquote dual threat. It's also he's a big guy, so it's you also have to be prepared for kind of how physical he's willing to be when he runs the football. And so that's that particular matchup to me is one of the big strength on strength kind of elements of this game and who wins kind of can Indiana kind of corral Notre Dame because Notre Dame can run the ball effectively or efficiently and also explosively. Can Indiana manage a quarterback that can hurt them with his legs as well as his arm? But then on the other hand, if Indiana can bottle Notre Dame up a little bit, is Riley Leonard, capable of a lot of 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9? Is he going to be able to make those throws that get you kind of the finish the drives that you need to finish? I think that is, if you're sort of like, if this is the pregame show and we're just saying what is the matchup you're looking at more than anything else, it is probably Indiana's front 6 against Notre Dame's run game. Because I think if you tell me right now Notre Dame runs the football effectively, I find it hard to imagine Indiana wins. If you tell me right now Indiana neutralizes that run game, I think Indiana's got a much better shot.
Yeah, it's Jeremiyah Love and Jadarian Price are probably, compared to Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins at Ohio State, like that's the same level of player. So they're a home run ball waiting to hit at all times. But I'm with you. And I mean, Notre Dame evaluated Leonard and Howard in the transfer portal a year ago. Felt Howard was a better passer. Leonard was a better runner, better leader. And the entire offense is predicated around Leonard as a run threat who also can throw. So it's like, the matchup to me, it's like, can they get tight end Mitchell Evans on those linebackers? So I think at his best, that's an NFL tight end, which is probably not something you're seeing a whole lot of week over week. But and it gets, offensively, like, how would you sum up the Cignetti scheme? Like, when I watch it or read about it, it seems like it's a lot of quick hitting, like a lot of slants, like they go. What's good there? What works?
It's a lot of timing throws, ton of RPO stuff. I mean, a lot of it is, and this is kind of like the difference that Kurtis Rourke makes is. It puts a lot of faith in the quarterback to process quickly and make the right decisions. They run the ball effectively, but Cignetti will tell you flat out it's pass offense. He's literally said, like, we used to run the ball 50 times a game, but I don't do that anymore. Now when it's operating well, it is very much an offense that can pass to run. Again, lots of quick stuff, slants, a really good perimeter blocking team. Like, whenever Urban Meyer would do an Indiana game, for whatever reason, it's like he couldn't get in front of a microphone fast enough to talk about how good of a perimeter blocking team he thought Indiana was. And that's wide receivers. It's, it's swing screens, bubble screens. Their running backs will get out and particularly Tyson Lawton will get out and get involved in the pass game as well. And the other thing that Indiana's been really good at this season in terms of like timing routes and things is, they went out and recruited 3 slot receivers out of the portal, all of whom will be gone after this year, that are all, particularly Miles Price and Keyshawn Williams, are really good at yards after catch. And it works because they run, like little quick hits, just sort of like one step and throw kind of stuff. But then these guys they're smaller, they're strong, they're quick. And so you get them moving downhill and they're just difficult to slow down. Keyshawn Williams had a run that kind of went viral during the Northwestern game where he's not a big guy, he's like 5'9", and he was just kind of just powering through people and he went for 50 something yards. The offense is designed around that. And then at the boundaries, they do a lot of back shoulder stuff, and I think they've mixed in a little bit more kind of double move because they've become such a sort of back shoulder, like the reputation for the ability that particularly Elijah Surratt, but sometimes also Omar Cooper has in those sort of one-on-one, back shoulder sideline throws has become so pronounced. Like, they've started mixing in some double move stuff. But they, when Rourke gets one of those guys one-on-one, he will go there with confidence. And it's almost kind of like this is obviously an oversimplification. Anything is, if we're not sitting here and diagramming, 100 plays and running people through the film. But like, it's almost like sometimes it feels like they'll have, kind of like a play for each side of the field. And one side is much more sort of the RPO, quick hit, option route kind of stuff that just puts a lot of faith in Rourke and then a lot of faith in his pass catchers. And then the other side's a little bit more kind of like zone buster stuff, and I don't know how much zone.
Not a lot. Like Notre Dame
plays. But I mean,
Notre Dame plays. I think they were number 1 or number 2 in the country in amount of man played.
Okay. But stuff that when they see a single high safety, they try to attack that with route combinations that kind of overlay one on the other and make the safety make a choice, and then Rourke that creates a one-on-one opportunity for Rourke somewhere. The safety goes with one or the other, and Rourke targets the other receiver. So it is a pass first offense. It is heavily reliant upon Rourke, and he did not look good in the second half of the Michigan game. He did not look good in the, other than kind of that first drive, and I guess maybe to some extent their last scoring drive of the Ohio State game. Obviously, listen, when you're getting pressured as much as he was, it's going to be hard to look good. But it was also a little bit surprising in those games, Michigan in particular, because he played so well in the first half, because he had actually been one of the best quarterbacks in the country under pressure. And that seemed to be the thing that, like, I'm not like Mr. NFL Draft, but when I talked to people who were more, sort of tuned into like what scouts were saying and all that, one of the things that it seemed like the pro people liked about Rourke was how good he'd been against pressure. And then kind of, again, it's just that 6-quarter window of, the second half of the Michigan game and the 4 quarters in Columbus, when it was like Indiana kind of struggled to get things organized at the line of scrimmage and Rourke just couldn't kind of play his way through it. And that's, I would imagine, at least to some extent, that's what Notre Dame's going to be looking at this weekend or next weekend. I keep thinking it's this weekend.
The Friday game has completely messed with my internal calendar.
It is kind of funky. And it's also, like you're used to like just a bowl layoff. Like they're not supposed to be playing until after Christmas, but here we are.
I have a panic that it's going to be December 20th at 7 p.m. and be like, oh crap, the game's tonight, thinking that it's still a Saturday. I use offensive line. I think they lost 1 or 2 guys during the course of the season. Like, just sort of a status check of that, because I do think like Notre Dame's defensive line is very good. I think they lack sort of a singular pass rusher on the outside due to injury, but their defensive tackles are outstanding. What does IU have at the offensive line right now? Where's sort of like, if there's a weak link to it, where is it?
Yeah, it's probably depth as much as anything else. They lost their starting right guard in the preseason. They lost their starting left guard before the Michigan game. They were able to plug both of those holes with players that have been, pretty adequate. Bray Lynch is a younger guy, but has kind of come along well. And then Tyler Stevens was kind of a swing player. One of the JMU transfers who actually had wound up playing when Indiana was healthier, a lot of tight end in sort of heavy situations, just because they wanted to get an extra blocker on the field. They don't really have anything behind that at this point. Everything behind their first 5 now is true freshman, redshirt freshman, maybe like one redshirt sophomore who could factor in a pinch. The group they have there is pretty experienced, 3rd year, I think 5th year, 6th year, 3rd year, 5th year. And the tackles have been really good. Actually, that was, again, kind of the surprise around the Michigan game in particular was, like Indiana's tackles, Carter Smith and Trey Wettig, have been really, really good this season. And it was the edge rushers that were giving them trouble against Michigan, more so than like Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant. The tackles, the interior line probably should have been more of the weakness, especially in that Michigan game. That was right after Drew Evans, their left guard, got hurt. And so they were breaking in Stevens at left guard, and it was all kind of new. But it was the edges that they struggled with. And then the Ohio State game is, again, like it's hard to know exactly how to sort of transpose the Ohio State game over this, because basically what happened in that game was Ohio State timed up Indiana's silent count. And Indiana is going to make every effort to make sure that doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
And so, if you look at that Ohio State game, and the line really struggled in that game. But the reason the line really struggled, and we've even heard linemen saying this afterward, is because it was almost at times like Ohio State, blitzers were hitting the line moving because they'd figured out how to time up the snap count. And obviously, I mean, I guess it should go without saying that if Notre Dame times up Indiana's silent count again, then that's going to be a real problem. But the game that I think is in some ways almost more instructive to, like, has Indiana improved enough to manage high level, let's say even like borderline NFL level talent, maybe even, I mean, these guys better than me, maybe even just flat out clearly NFL level talent along the line of scrimmage offensively, is probably more the Michigan game. Now, with respect, I don't know if there's a program in the country that's got a better overall collection of defensive tackles than Michigan. But just in general, like, that was the game where it felt like it was less about structure or scheme, and it was more about guys just losing individual battles, just one-on-one moments when guys were struggling. And that was a funny game too, because I mean, they were up 17-3 at halftime. They were outgaining Michigan something like 230-95. Like, if they just transposed the second half, or if they, I keep using that word transposed, I'm not even sure I'm using it correctly, but if they just repeated the second half, the first half and the second half, then they would have beat Michigan, I guess, 34-6, and we wouldn't think anything of that game again. But it was because of the way that in what should have been sort of an Indiana-friendly environment at home, it wasn't like there were a lot of Michigan fans there at all. They just kind of started losing individual battles at the line of scrimmage. That's the one that I think I would be more kind of worried about if I were an Indiana fan. You've just got to hope that, between Rourke, Cignetti, the offensive line, they've worked out how to avoid what happened with the snap count against Ohio State. It was the Michigan game where it felt like they lost kind of the individual battles in that was what got them into trouble in that game.
Yeah, I'd be interested to sort of see how Howard Cross and Riley Mills match up in this game, because it's like that's sort of why I think Indiana will struggle to move the ball, is like Notre Dame has better individual matchup winners on the interior of the line than Indiana does. Let's wrap up on this. Like, it's the first. Like, I've covered Notre Dame for 24 years. You've been on IU for 17. Like, we don't get a lot of firsts anymore, especially up here. I mean, what are you expecting the environment to see? What are you expecting, like, the IU fan turnout to be? Just like when you think about like what December 20th is going to look like at 8 p.m., what do you think we're going to be watching?
I mean, I'm fascinated to know. IU fans are going to try, believe me. And, I don't know. I mean, fan bases like Notre Dame tend to be a little bit better at putting up the firewall in terms of tickets and things. And it does seem a little bit like, I mean, and listen, this is like just social media, so take it with a grain of salt, obviously. But what I have seen has suggested to me that Notre Dame fans are aware of that and are trying to be, sort of proactively keep IU fans out of the stadium. But believe me, IU fans are going to try. And, some of it is, and I obviously, I think we've all seen the ticket prices, and someone suggested to me that they're going to come down, like the once tickets get circulated, they may come down a little bit, because I guess Notre Dame is one of the places that hasn't actually passed the tickets out yet.
Not everyone has them in hand yet.
Yeah. But either way, it's going to be a big get-in number. And there's an extent to which I think Indiana fans are going to look at it and say, we got to be there because I never thought I'd see this, in my life. I also do think there's an extent to which Indiana fans are going to be there because they just kind of believe this team is going to do it. And not because, I mean, like, I don't know, this sounds weird. Like, believe me, I've covered enough IU football, like, to know how all this is generally supposed to work, or historically has kind of unfolded. But this group, they don't care. I mean, like there is nothing, they do not, and their fan bases embrace this, feel like Cinderella at all. Again, I can take you back months and show you examples of players talking about winning a national title and just saying like, that's the expectation and maybe we'll do it, maybe we won't, but that's why we're here. That's what we're all trying to do. And then you have a coach, obviously, in Curt Cignetti, that is, one of his, there's some Cignettiisms that kind of go around, and one of them is no self-imposed limitations. He's got a group that's really bought into that idea. And so I think Indiana will show up believing it's going to win the game. And Indiana fans will show up, however many of them can make it in, believing they have a very real chance, and not because they've sort of fallen in love with this romantic idea of fate and it's Indiana's year or whatever, but just because they believe, they all believe in the coach, they all believe in the players, they all believe in each other. And, for the most part, let's be fair, they haven't really been given a lot of reason not to. Now, if you made me sit here and pick, and I don't know if I'll do an actual prediction or not. If you made me sit here and pick, I probably wouldn't pick Indiana. But I wouldn't be surprised if they won. This would not, I wouldn't be shocked, because I do think, and have thought for at least a few weeks now, that this really is just a good football team. And, how good, we'll see. And, listen, you can be a really, really good football team and still not win a national title, because, that's life when you get to the top of the mountain. But I do think, I mean, if nothing else, I guess I would be surprised if Indiana threw out a repeat of Ohio State. I think Indiana will come into this game believing it can compete and it can win. I think as many Indiana fans as can get their hands on tickets will make themselves heard. Obviously, it will probably help that the colors clash. So you can, for years, Indiana would take its sort of panoramic stadium photos when Ohio State was in town, because you couldn't tell the difference between Indiana fans and Ohio State fans from 5,000 feet in the air. You'll know how many Indiana fans are there, certainly. But like I said, the most remarkable piece of all this, and the journey may end next Friday night, I don't know. But the most remarkable piece of all this has just kind of been the extent to which everyone around it that I've observed has just been completely unfazed by it, and I've gotten the question in various forms this season, when do you think this all might get too much for Indiana? And I've always just kind of said, I think if it was going to, it would have by now. They believe they belong here. Their coach and his staff have gotten them here. And I guess now we're going to find out if they can actually do it.
Yeah, it's going to be a heck of a scene on December 20th up here when Indiana comes to Notre Dame for the first ever college football playoff game in the 12-team field. And Zach, you'll be up here. I'll be there. Yeah, it's going to be a fun scene to document and be a fun game to write about. So, Zach, I appreciate you coming on The Independent to talk a little bit about you, shed some light on Coach Google and what's made the magic happen down there, because they've been one of the great stories in college football this season. So, Zach, appreciate you being on the show, and we'll see you on December 20th, which is a Friday, which I will have to remind myself many times between now and then. All right, that's a wrap for this episode of The Independent. Thanks again to Zach Osterman for joining the show. I'll be back next week with a guest. Probably going to sound out Tim Murray to come on as Matt Fortuna, my regular host, continues to be on the mend. But yeah, big week coming up next week with Notre Dame opening the college football playoff, the first game of the 12-team era. It's on campus at Notre Dame. I think another question I've been getting a lot of questions about is just sort of like what the game day atmosphere would be like. Talked to somebody at Notre Dame on Friday. They said, yes, Notre Dame and IU's sort of walkout videos will both be played. There will still be a player walk outside the stadium as usual, regardless of the temperatures. We'll see about that. And then also Notre Dame is in basic control of the video board. There are some things they have to do to sort of comply with the college football playoff, but I was assured that it will feel a little bit more like a home game than a bowl game, which is something I was a little bit curious about going into the week. So until our next show on The Independent, thanks for being with us. Again, thanks to Zach Osterman for some insight on Indiana. And we'll talk to you next week when it's game week. Thanks for being with us on this episode of The Independent.